Hi everyone, I'm Emma, a researcher at Climate Outreach. I'm really excited to be here today for an interview with Holly Brazier Tope, the head of politics at Green Alliance, an independent think tank and charity focusing on ambitious leadership for the environment. We will hear about the work of Green Alliance today from Holly, and Holly will also be kindly sharing with us some key lessons and advice for engaging the government on climate and environmental issues. Holly, thank you so much for agreeing to sit down with me today and to discuss your work.
No
So let's
problem.
get straight to it. Please, can you tell us a little bit about Green Alliance and your work?
Of course. So, as you said, I'm head of politics at Green Alliance, and Green Alliance is an NGO and think tank focused on basically big political leadership on the environment. So, we convene a number of the biggest environmental NGOs in the sector, and we engage with government on how to make change happen on both the climate and nature agenda. And we see it as our responsibility to kind of push forward ideas that they aren't thinking about and issues relating to our agenda that are much less covered, so things like resources and circular economy, adaptation, not just mitigation, but also engage on the government of the day's priorities and what that looks like in terms of legislation, but also in terms of big and bold and interesting ideas. I've been here for just over a year, and before that, I spent 6 years working in Parliament, so I know the ropes pretty well in terms of Westminster. But it's quite nice being out of the bubble.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's really great to be connected and with all of your expertise that you've just described. So I'm really, really excited to hear a bit more from you today. So next, I'd really like to hear what would be your key insights for organisations hoping to engage this government on issues such as climate and the environment.
Big question. I think it's probably most useful to just start with a little bit of context, because obviously we're the other side of a general election that was fairly momentous for our issues. It was not fought as a climate election as it has been in the past, but actually the government had GB Energy and the creation of like one of the biggest policies that they are fighting for is on climate and energy. So it's having like Britain as a clean energy superpower. And that in itself encompasses many of the things that we work on. So while it wasn't a climate nature election, actually it was kind of proven that they have a massive mandate to enact huge policies and huge change in the coming years. Obviously, that context would be pointless without talking a little bit about the Conservatives. Obviously, they lost a huge number of seats. They now had a leadership contest that was fought between, whether they go slightly further to the right and acknowledge the threat that reform posed in the election, or if they go slightly more centre ground. Obviously, Kemi Badenoch won out, and there are some real challenges there, as are their challenges with reform at the next election and what that means for us. But in terms of what that means for organisations like us that are hoping to engage government on issues like climate and environment, I think the fact that Labour had a really rocky first 100 days is quite important. And yet, that being said, they've stuck to many of the things that we would consider to be incredibly important for this Parliament. So the fact that Keir Starmer went to COP when many other leaders didn't, the fact that David Lammy gave his first speech on climate and nature on the international stage, the fact that in the first few weeks, Ed Miliband et al., lifted the onshore wind ban and did things like setting up GB Energy and the National Wealth Fund. They are huge strides in our space. And I think having clarity on the mission boards, so to make Britain a clean energy superpower, is incredibly helpful for our agenda. And I think what we need to push is the fact that actually we are now in a completely different space with a completely different government who have different priorities. So for us, that means that, we're looking at pushing an open door. Basically, the civil service are now open to talking to the sector. They are really keen to engage, and different stakeholders matter. So businesses obviously were the heart of the last government. And while they are still incredibly important for Labour, it is just a bit of a different ballgame now, that actually, instead of businesses leading the way, that Labour are recognising that they want the state to lead the way on many of our issues. And that means that there is increased engagement with people like academics, civil society, unions, mayors and devolved administrations. And that's a really big deal for us in how we engage and what we can hope to achieve in this parliament. It is not to say it was all, sunshine and roses, because it's not. But I think that we just are in a very different context, and we kind of need to recognise that and match that ambition as a sector.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think kind of having that context as you just described is really, really useful, and the kind of clarity of those mission boards and things like that you described. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your insights on that. And so just to follow up on that a little bit more, are there any ways in which engagement with this government will or should look different from before?
Definitely. I mean, well, we hope. Obviously, I've already touched a little bit on civil servants and how much that's changed the game for us, because they now really have been told by ministers that they need to engage and get civil society and the public much more on board. And that has really been big implications for the work that we're doing. Also, government just have way more resource. So, they've had 14 years in opposition where they've relied on a handful of advisors and staff employed by individual MPs. Now they have the entirety of the civil service. It's important that they use that, the shift in that in a useful way, because they need to go in with each department and really establish what their aims are in order to, step change the way the civil service has worked, and that the civil service aren't dictating policy, that it is the other way around. But I think that genuinely they do want new kind of big and exciting ideas, and that is going to help us in the way that we engage, and we can be a lot more interesting and radical and honest about the engagements that we're having on the ground and grassroots level and talking to communities and trying to reflect that in our conversations with Westminster. I think the fact that they have also created new government positions to reflect kind of evolving priorities, so there's a minister for the just transition, that kind of thing, is a real opportunity for us. And the fact that they have, such a big majority means that the legislative time in the next year, it can be used very efficiently. Obviously, that means that they need to do it right and they need to have the right priorities. But with such a large majority, they can get pretty much whatever they want through Parliament. So it's relying on them doing that wisely and making sure that legislation is working towards those key missions. That is not to say that everything is necessarily going to be positive, because I think some things might get harder. And I think that things that don't relate to those missions are going to be more difficult and much less of a priority for government. So obviously the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero are completely focused on the mission to get clean power by 2030 and make Britain a clean energy superpower, with the knock-on effect that will reduce people's energy bills. That is by no means the only thing that's within scope of that department. And I think engaging on the other things that are beyond that is going to be a lot more difficult. And I think that has already had an impact on things like, insulation and the Warm Homes Plan. Labour came into government with really big plans on that, but actually they have not yet come to fruition. And we expected to see them in the budget. They didn't come. So things that actually tangibly affect people's lives on a day-to-day, and how they engage with government and how they deem the success of a government, it's going to be quite hard to push those through. And we have a responsibility as a sector to really push that. And I think finally, the thing to note is that actually they have already used some of their political capital. So we've had some quite controversial things that have happened, cutting the winter fuel payment, all of the farming protests and what happened around the budget with inheritance tax, as well as things like capping the 2-child benefit cap. I think that there are just some big issues in using your political capital so early means that you may well not be able to enact radical or interesting policies later on, because actually you've already used up your space to kind of talk to particular stakeholders and groups. So I think that will affect some of the things that we are working on in terms of, radical and interesting conversations on DEFRA and land use and farming and how that all interacts with the climate and nature crisis that we're fighting. So I think it's a really mixed picture, and I think it is going to be very different with this government. A lot of that is positive, but not all of it.
Yeah, thank you so much for all those really rich insights. And I think just listening to you talk about that mixed picture and how we can, organisations like us and like us, can really work with and engage with the government going forward. And I think just learning from your insights is really, really useful. So thank you very, very much for your time today, Holly. Thank you for delivering a brilliant seminar to Climate Outreach earlier as well. So this video and a preceding internal seminar are part of a series of seminars we organise here at Climate Outreach. And through these seminars, we aim to learn from researchers and experts like Holly to expand our understanding, explore new insights, and learn how and where we can really create better impact with our work. So thank you very much for watching.